Alright, so let's get started in jumping into Unit 4. We're into assessment now, so you've got your understandings, you've got your essential questions, you really kind of start to put together everything, your foundation is laid. Now it's time to start looking at, well, how do I know they know it? Alright, and so that's a very important question, so let's get started. Now, the first thing that you need to do when you develop an assessment is you need to start thinking like an assessor. This was a big shift for me, and it wasn't made as evident to me until later in my career, and then I was actually able to see where we fell short in other areas as well. I'll give you a prime example. It's also in the book, but because I had seen it so many times, it really rang true to me. It was something that I had talked to people about. So, kindergarten is a very good example. The 100th day of school is a big event. If you've never been in an elementary school, 100th day of school, there's parades or there's parties, or it's a big deal because for a couple reasons. Number one, you're getting close to a couple months left of school. You're through the holidays. You're into January, February, and you're getting close to spring. So that's a big deal. But more importantly, because place value is stressed at the kindergarten level, it's one of their major math areas. So there are lots of posters and cool things, and I'll never forget, I was sitting in a room with a bunch of kindergarten teachers, and one was proudly telling about all this cool project she did, demonstrates place value, and was trying to get everybody to do it. And basically what the kids did is they found something that described them, whether it be candy because they like candy, or buttons because they collected buttons, or whatever. Pictures of dogs because they love dogs, and they had to take 100 of them and glue them on a piece of paper, and some did it in the shape of the number 100 and this, that, and the other. And she was so proud of it because they tied everything together and it proved that they got the place value. Well, what really they were proving is that they could count to 100. There was no rows of columns or things like that where you saw that it was 10 rows of 10, no groups of 10, things like that really would have shown that they understand the place value aspect of it. So really that wasn't the right evidence, and that could be stated for a lot of us. I'll get into one embarrassing example about myself later. So there are three basic questions to really, when you start thinking like an assessor. And the first one, of course, is that what evidence do I need to know that they've got it? What kinds of evidence do I need? And this is to kind of start framing what your test should look like. And I guarantee you the right evidence isn't a multiple choice test. Now, I'm not saying multiple choice shouldn't ever be used anywhere, but what I am saying is that it shouldn't be your sole use of assessment at the end of a union, because that doesn't prove anything to me. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into validity later. The second question is, what specific characteristics in the student products do I need to examine to really determine whether or not they understood it? So, this is where we start looking at rubrics and those kinds of things, which we're going to get to in a little bit as well. And the third one really has to do with validity. Does this evidence enable us to infer how much understanding they have? So you're really looking at the type of test first with the first question, how you're going to assess it in the second question, and then does it really prove that the students understand it, or how much lack of understanding do they have? So that's the three basic questions as you go through that. Now, as far as we start talking about authentic tasks, this is a big push right now. If we really need students to know this, and really need students to understand it, then there should be some applicable way for it to appear, whether in real life or in situations where these things occur. There should be ways to prove that with or frame it in a problem. And this gives a lot of examples on pages 152 to 160 about how you can start putting those things in more realistic settings. So it's not just a problem here, a problem there, question here, question there, short answer here, multiple choice there. And it really gives some great ideas of types of evidence, some performance tasks and things like that can really be important to you. So I really recommend you kind of go through that. They talk about just different ways to really frame your problems to bring that learning to life. So that's the next part. And then they bring up the 6 facets. And they talk about that all the way through pages 161 through 167, but there really is a great table on pages 163 and 164. And what they really do is they give examples of how you can show understanding through each one of the facets. So if you're looking for, I mean, how do I show that they really understand this? Well, there are different ways to break it down through the 6 facets of understanding. So, like I said, it's described in great detail on those pages, but that table is fantastic for showing that. Okay, and then as you're also thinking like an assessor, a lot of times we have a hard time coming up with questions or scenarios, and it's very tempting to look at those essential questions that you've developed. That's not a bad thing. Take those essential questions, use those, because that's the whole crux of your unit right there, are those EQs. Use that to frame your assessment, but don't think that all you have to do is take those essential questions and say, hey, these are my questions for my assessment. That's not nearly good enough, because for several reasons, it doesn't really give any kind of framework. It doesn't put it in any kind of real life textual situation, and more importantly, it really doesn't, it's almost impossible for students to be able to quote unquote define your essential question in a way that will make sense to you and will really prove that they're understanding. It could really turn into a regurgitation of your answering of those questions as a group throughout class as well. So using your essential questions is a great idea, but not word for word in the test. Use it to frame your assessment. They give a great example of that on page 168. There's a table at the top of the page where they take some essential questions and then they turn them into performance tasks based on those EQs. So that's a great way to do it. Now, when we get to the last part, is we start talking about evidence, and we talk about, are we really showing what we need to show? There's a great table on page 170, and it talks about the fact that traditional quizzes and tests, what we call assessments before we really started looking at understanding, paper and pencil in those multiple choice tests, they basically look at facts. And remember, back in Unit 1, we talked about the basic core of understanding should be the big ideas and the core tasks. And then, if you've got time, try to get to those important things that, important things that to know and important things that you should do, be able to do. And then those little outlying facts, if you have plenty of time, those things that are worth being familiar with, dates and places and facts and things like that. So when we are using our traditional tests, we're only really assessing the things that are worth being familiar with, that highest level that is kind of a dream if we can get to those kinds of things. If they're really good questions, we might get into some of those important things to know and to do, but we don't really even touch the big ideas and core tasks. And when we really start using performance tasks, projects, things that are open-ended, things that are authentic, that are applicable, we really are hitting those big ideas and core tasks. We're making them apply it to everyday situations. We're really making them show that they understand the big ideas throughout the course. So we really need to take a look at our assessment. So am I going to reject a multiple choice test if you say that that's your assessment? To be honest, yeah, I probably will, because that does not really get at the crux of what you're trying to get accomplished. So that's a little bit about thinking like an assessor, which is Chapter 7. As we get to Chapter 8, the first half talks about the criteria. So how do we measure this? What does this look like? And the first part, we start talking about the need for rubrics. So when we start talking about why we need rubrics, it's really it's kind of twofold. The first half is we need to have something that's measurable, especially if we're going into performance tasks. When we're looking at performance tasks and we just throw out some open-ended thing, that's great, but how do the students know what we want them to know? And that's kind of the second half. Not only are we able to measure their responses, but they're able to see those what we're looking for before they even craft their response. It's not really cheating, it's not really going to help them form an answer, but it really kind of gets at, oh, this is how I need to frame it, this is what it needs to look like, this is what the teacher is looking for. So we start talking about the need for those rubrics. It's beneficial for both the instructor and the student. When there are two types of rubrics, there are holistic and analytic rubrics, and they go into great detail in those 3 pages right there. But in a nutshell, holistic rubrics are, they give one overall score. If you were ever in music or band and you ever went to a performance, you did your performance and you were given a score of a 1, a 2, or a 3, usually 1 being the best, 3 being the worst. That was a holistic, it was your overall score. It was, did you stay in tune? Did you follow along with everybody else in the group? Was it choreographed well? And I'm not a music person, so I apologize if that's not correct. But basically, there's a whole lot of different subsets that are looked at, and you're given one overall score for that. That's a holistic rubric. And analytic rubrics break down by skill, and the rubrics that I use for this course are analytic because I look at many different things, including grammar and spelling, since this is a professional level course. So there are lots of different areas, therefore it's an analytic score. So then we start talking about using those rubrics to assess levels of understanding. And that's a very important distinction, because you're not just looking at, number correct anymore. You're looking at what did they actually understand, and that gets a little bit more in the weeds. And it really requires that proof. So again, it goes to show why you can't really assess that through a multiple choice test, because what you're really doing is you're looking at the level of understanding that a student has. And they give a lot of different examples and ways to look at it. I also give some in the course, in the assignment, in that week's folder. But they really do a good job of talking about breaking down the levels as far as the examples they give is a 5 might be a proficient, and 4 is called capable, and 3 is adequate, and 2 is limited, and 1 is poor. They really talk about using really descriptive words there, and not just great, good, bad, which unfortunately I've actually seen on some rubrics. So be very careful with your wording and things like that, but they really kind of talk about, and they give some great examples about using the facets and some of those descriptions of the facets. I highly recommend pages 178, 179, because they give a list of descriptors that fit each of the 6 facets as well. So it's a good dry run if you've never made a rubric before, or you feel like your rubrics are not up to par, especially after reading these chapters. So then they give a list of steps for designing and refining rubrics, and there's a very important piece that comes in here that I really like to stress, and that is that you should have examples for students as well. Not only do they need to see the rubrics, they need to see a good example of what it looks like. Now, if it's something that's very task specific, if you're giving a performance event where you look at, if they read it, they're going to have all the answers. Well, then you want something from a different type of performance event that's framed the same way, that's scored the same way, but on a different and a different topic. So they do need to see examples, and when I say examples, I mean examples of what's strong, examples of medium, and examples of weak. Okay, so they need to see it across the levels so that they can actually define it. And one activity that I used to do with students at the first part of the year, when you're going through all that procedural stuff anyway, is I would give them examples of student work from previous years, and after we've gone through everything, gone through the rubric, and they would have to try to see what score it would be. So it was a fun game for them. But it was one where they really got to understand what those qualities were that I was looking for. And I always tried to find somebody that had really terrible handwriting but knew what they were doing, because you'll find out that one of the biases that students have is messy handwriting equals not knowledgeable. So I tried to break those stereotypes that they may have held. So anyway, the steps that they talk about for designing and refining your rubrics is to gather samples of student performance that really go across that spectrum, sort it into different stacks, and write down the reasons. Why did you make this one? Why did you put that one in the strong pile? Why did you put that one in the medium pile? And then you just have this long running list of reasons why you put them everywhere. And then you cluster those reasons into traits or important dimensions. Like when I look at mine, I might look at the level. Does it really show understanding? Is it all encompassing of everything in your unit? And you start breaking apart those different tasks or those different things you're actually looking at. And you write a definition or those descriptors for each trait. And then you select samples, good strong examples of a strong one, a good example of a medium, a good example of a weak, and then continuously refine it. That's the last part, is if you get something that's a better anchor or example of one of those levels, then replace it or refine your rubric as well. If you come up with other descriptors, or you say, maybe I shouldn't look at that anymore, maybe I should look at something different, or maybe I need to add to it or subtract from my rubric, make those changes as well. So that's a little bit more about designing your rubrics. Again, look at the examples that are given in the folder because they really help guide your thinking as well. Now, validity. We need to get away from correctness, because right now most of us, and myself, I was very much included in that group, was I looked at scores, I looked at percentages. Hey, 90%, they get it. 40%, oh, they don't get it. Well, we really need to look at that. Look at those percentages a lot deeper. What exactly did they get right? What exactly did they get wrong? And when we talk about that facet of self-knowledge, have them analyze that as well with you. We really stress that. In one of the districts I was in, we really stressed looking at your self-knowledge and looking at why did you get that wrong, or what is your overall level of understanding of this topic, and it really kind of helped them understand that they needed help, or they didn't. So the first thing that we need to look at is really carelessness, and I will give you a quick example of that. Let's say that Johnny you've got a 20 question multiple choice test, and Johnny gets 65%. Well, you say, well, Johnny knows what he's doing because he answers everything correctly in class, but he was just really careless. I mean, that's the easy teacher answer. I've given it so many times it's not funny. I'm actually ashamed to say that. But a lot of times it may not be carelessness. There might be one important piece of that understanding puzzle that they just don't get. And the questions that don't include that piece of understanding, they get it. And the 35% of the test that did have that, they didn't get. So really need to analyze each type of problem, each question, each task, everything that's on an assessment, and really analyze why is it that they got the score that they got. Was it carelessness? Was it lack of understanding? Was it not being able to read the directions? They give a great example in the book of somebody that's an English language learner that was not able to understand the math questions. Got the math, but just couldn't read the test very well, so was not quite clear on what the question was asking. So let's go into the problem with skill and drill. And I don't just mean this in a math sense. The problem with skill and drill is that we look too often at the individual question, and we just say they got it, they don't got it, they got it, they don't got it. And I know that's terrible grammar, but such as it is. I am embarrassed to say that when I first started giving multiple choice tests when I was a brand new teacher, I gave multiple choice tests in social studies, and I'm ashamed to say that my determination of validity, whether or not they really gave it their all, I had a nonsense answer as D on every single question of every single test. And I did it for two reasons. One, I thought it would be funny. The kids loved it. They thought, oh, this test is great, and this is funny. I love taking tests in Mr. Ponder's class. And the problem with that is that unless a student put D on any question, I assume they tried their best. Bad assumption. And it really takes away from the validity of the test, because now you're down to 3 correct answers, and they know that. And in addition to that, you're really looking again at luck of the draw. So every kid might have a 33% chance of getting each question right, versus a 0% chance of guessing it right on a performance task or a scenario or things like that. So really, when we look at the validity aspect, you cannot have validity on a strictly multiple choice test. It is a physical impossibility to have good, strong validity, because you don't know if a student guessed it right or they really got it right. Or by the same token, if you're doing something that maybe they just got 2 little facts backwards, or didn't read the question carefully enough and chose the wrong answer? Is it because they don't understand it, or because they just read the question wrong or tried to go too quickly? So, I mean, you really need to look at your validity there. Okay, so the last point on validity is that the validity is more about the inferences we draw rather than the test itself. I think that's a great quote, because basically what they're talking about, it talks about the meaning of evidence. You know, what are we asking students to do, and what are we really interpreting those results? And so that's kind of the summation of the whole unit here on an assessment is, are we really drawing the right inference from the information that we're given? And again, if they guess 75% of the questions right, does that really mean that, are we inferring that they get it? Well, we probably are, and we might be very wrong. So that's kind of the driving point. Highly recommend you review these chapters, because I've gone over them very quickly because I don't want to go on for an hour. So now let's talk about your assessment, because the next step in this process is for you to start creating your assessment. The first thing that you need to know that we've hopefully been able to get out of these 2 chapters is that an assessment is not just about assessing students. It should also be looked at as a measuring stick for you. How is your teaching? How many times have you heard a colleague say, well, those kids just don't get it because most of them failed to, I had more than half the class failed the test. That tells me that the teacher fell short, not the students. So rarely have I ever seen more than half of a class of students that just didn't want to perform well. That is, those kids are still more the exception than the rule. So, think of an assessment not only as the ability to help your students improve, but help yourself improve as well. I mean, if you see the same things, you should be analyzing those results and saying, well, these kids, 3/4 of the kids didn't get this area of understanding. I really need to look at how I'm teaching that. So that's the first part. And in assessment, when I say an assessment, and hopefully this was really hit hard throughout these 2 chapters when you review them, is that it doesn't need to be a traditional paper and pencil test. And I think I've beaten the multiple choice short answer piece to death, so I'm not going to go into detail there, but it can be a performance task, it can be an activity. But one of the big key things is, don't do an activity for the sake of doing an activity. They give a great example in the chapters on somebody that created a great diorama, and it sounded so exciting on Civil War, and they had to really encompass all this stuff about the Civil War, and boy, this was a fun activity, and the kids love it. There's rubrics, and there's great rubrics, and all that stuff. The problem is that a student could do really well by making a diorama and not understand half the objectives, or half the big ideas, or half the essential questions, but the diorama could look great. If that's the case, it's not a good assessment. So really, if you're doing an activity, you also need to look and make sure that it's actually going to assess what you want it to assess. That evidence piece at the very beginning of the chapter, the validity piece at the end of chapter 8. Make sure that you're actually doing an activity that makes sense. Rubrics should be part of the assessment. Really, there really is no way around this. Again, though, I've said this before. If you find a great rubric that you can modify. Great, use it. You don't have to create your own rubrics from scratch. Just make sure you give credit for where you got it, and you don't have to say, I changed this. Just say adapted from blah 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 blah. Give the website or the text or wherever you get it from. You don't lose points for borrowing and modifying. I think that's called smart. Very rarely will you find one that fits perfectly, but you might be able to adapt it for your needs. Okay, the next one, the length or number of questions is not always a measure of excellence. We always look and we say, well, I've got 7 objectives, or I've got throughout this unit I've got 15 essential questions. If I do 2 questions for every essential question, then I have 30 questions. That's going to be a good test. Not really. Not necessarily even. It might be, but it may not be as well. You might have 2 or 3 performance tasks, and that's it. And it encompasses everything. All your essential questions, all your understandings are in there in 2 or 3 performance tasks. So be wary of that. The length does not matter. What matters is, are you really assessing what you want to assess? Do you have good criteria? And is it valid? Those are the things I'm going to look at, not length. I couldn't care less about the length. And then again, think about validity. So make sure that this is something that is really going to give you the results that you want, that you're able to take those results and you can look at every single student in your class and say, yes, that student understands. No, that student does not understand. If you can't do that, your assessment is falling short. So there probably will be questions about this. The first thing I will tell you that you need to do is go back and review the chapters. And if you still have questions, put them in the question forum. That's why it's there. Don't be afraid to ask. So hopefully this has been very helpful. But again, I'm here if you have questions, if you need help. Good luck.